Welcome to QueerTWENTY, the cohort of 2020. QueerTWENTY is egomonk's annual flagship program where we celebrate exceptional queer Indians hailing from different parts of life. Today, we have Rohin Bhatt with us. Rohin is a non-binary queer rights activist, a lawyer, and a bioethicist. You may know Rohin from their coverage by Print last year, um, where the newspaper covered this story um, that Rohin asked Chief Justice Chandrachud to add an additional column in code slip for mentioning advocates' pronouns. They currently work with senior advocates Indira Jaising and Anand Grover and appeared in the ongoing Supreme Court case for legalizing queer marriages. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Rohin. Rohin, thank you so much for joining us today. Um, so my first question to you is, as a non-binary person who's practicing law in India, what unique perspectives or insights do you carry to your work? As in, how do these two sections of your lives emerge and intersect?
Well, it's a heavy question, and I think the answer is going to be quite long-winded. So there's two parts to it. I think first of it is me in the courtroom, and the second part to it is me uh, working on a case. Let me deal with both of them. For the part where I am in the courtroom, I think it is not lost on me that when I walk into a courtroom, more often than not, I am perhaps one of the only few openly queer and non-binary person in the court. That is not to say that there are not a lot of queer people and non-binary people in our courts. So there is in that way kind of this glass ceiling that perhaps, the conventional wisdom, at least at the bar, dictates that you walk a certain way, you talk a certain way, you present a certain way. Which perhaps is determined by a patriarchal notion of what a lawyer should look like, what a lawyer should dress like, what a lawyer should do. I've gone to courtrooms multiple times, with my nails painted flaming red. I've gone to court with my nails painted all sorts of colors. And I think a lot of that is a privilege of having a boss that kind of lets you do your own thing without interference. I've known of multiple people whose dress choices, whose ways of presenting themselves have been policed by their bosses. So in that, it's a matter of incredible privilege that I have in terms of a boss who's accepting. The second part of it is when one is working on a case, I think one's own lived experiences of the of discrimination, of other things that has shaped the way I look at the law and the way I kind of perceive the law also shapes the way I think about the law, I think about the judicial processes, and I think about the world in general.
All right. Uh, Rohin, like you practice in the Supreme Court, like you practice in in our capital of the nation. You must be close to political and legal issues from a different perspective, given the identity and the intersection that you lay in. With that as a context, can you provide insights into like how legal systems in India can either safeguard or sadly jeopardize the rights of pure individuals, especially in the face of rising fascist ideologies that we have?
I think law can be liberating and law can be oppressing, right? So, in terms of liberation, these are all your celebrated judgments of Naftage and this and that, where the law perhaps tells us that you have a claim to equality, that you have the right to love without state interference. When it manifests on the ground, it perhaps is not so easy. Every day, you get calls. I have received calls multiple times from people in intercaste, interfaith marriages, facing police oppressions. I've received calls where, there have been threats of honor killing. Queerness in that way perhaps adds one more layer of vulnerability to these couples. Every few days you see in media about cases being filed by parents against queer people, fascinating developments in the past few months where high courts have been sending parents for counseling. And perhaps the most recent example in the Delhi High Court shows that the parents, despite the counseling, refused to accept a child's identity. And so perhaps, what happens is law in that case can be used as a tool for kind of grabbing hold of a person that escapes the violence of the natal family. Even though they are adults, kidnapping complaints are filed, abduction complaints are filed, with the sole purpose of using the state machinery and the police machinery to uh, grab hold of the queer person and perhaps bring them back to the family where they may be subjected to conversion therapy, corrective rapes, uh, and what have you. Uh, that apart, I think is the we must kind of understand that social revolutions seldom take place within the legal structures, right? Queer liberation will never be achieved through litigation. But at the same time, I think we cannot ignore that the legal system plays a very important role in oppressing queer people. Uh, which is why it becomes important to take cases to court, which is why it becomes important to engage critically with the legal system than just dismissing it as if it is only a tool for oppression. Used wisely, I think the legal system can be of incredible help to queer people in realizing not just their fundamental right to love, but other rights as well.
Fascism is affecting the way queer movement has been dealt with by the activists themselves, and two, um, the way law is used as an instrumentality of change.
Right. I think, it's difficult to think about queer rights in silos as compared to what's happening around the country. Uh, right? I am dealing with a couple of cases of queer people from Manipur right now. So the gross human rights violations that you are seeing there, the state-sponsored violence that we are seeing in Manipur, is not kind of divested and divorced from what is happening to queer people there. So we must not, and this is perhaps one of the things that we as queer rights movement have to do better, is to build solidarities with other movements, right? For example, the demands of horizontal reservation for trans people is not divorced from the horizontal demands for women. So there is a scope there for building inter-movement solidarity with the feminist movement. The same demand for horizontal reservations is not divested from the anti-caste movement and the movement for reservations and the clampdown on the very nature of reservations that we are seeing, where we've kind of moved away from social oppression as a reservation to oppose social oppression as to reservation, which is now accorded on the basis of your economic status through the 103rd Constitutional Amendment. So these rights are not kind of um, divested from each other. But at the same time, with the growth of fascist ideologies in this country and the clampdown on civil liberties, what we are seeing is far more sinister, right? We've seen sedition cases which have been filed at at the Queer Rights March here in Bombay, where I currently am. We've seen perhaps, uh, you know, at the Delhi Pride Parade for last year, for example, a heavily guarded police presence. And that to me is a symbolic of how the state is day in and day out interfering with fundamental rights. So long as we do not build solidarities across movements, it's going to be difficult for us to recognize and to perhaps be effective at bringing forth a social change. And it also perhaps, is a reality of who we are. When I think when we say that I contain multitudes, is not simply about who I am, but the axes of identities in which we exist. We are not simply queer people. We come from different castes, different creeds, different gender identities, disabilities. All of these conversations need to happen
And that
simultaneously.
was very
They
well
need to happen in
articulated. Think about talking about following and asking for multitude of goals and multitude of rights, right? Coming to gay marriage. So gay marriages within queer movement have faced certain criticism, potentially for diverting the attention from the urgent issues like, employment and housing. I think the non-profit industrial complex also plays some part in it. Now, with that as a context, could you share your perspective on how the movement can strike a balance between advocating for same-sex marriages, but also addressing very pressing survival issues like social economic concerns?
Uh, I've had sort of this arc where I've uh, gone from being a vocal opponent of uh, litigating marriage first to being one of the lawyers on the case. And I think that has to deal with two parts. First is the role of marriage in India to maintain caste hierarchy. And the second is uh, the need for marriage as a legitimate legal need, right? For me, the issue was not so much about marriage as it was about a claim to equality that we were making it at in before the Supreme Court. For me, the way at least I looked at it, for me, it was not simply about marriage. Of course, it was about marriage because marriage was at the centrality of the litigation. But it was more importantly a plea for equality. Um, Having said that, you cannot ignore the caste dimensions of marriage, and multiple op-eds that I've written around marriage equality, I've dealt with it. I've said, yes,
Yeah.
marriage lays bare the caste and social hierarchies. Yes, the moment you talk about marriage, you cannot, kind of uh, ignore the way marriage happens in India. But at the same time, how do you say to somebody who wants to get married that, you know, you can't get married because the law does not let you? When the courts have recognized that A, there's a fundamental right to marry a person of your choice, and B, that queer people have the same rights as their cisgender heterosexual counterparts. So, A, it was a plea for equality, and B, that there is no point, and I think it's foolish if anybody tells you that no, gay marriage will not replicate caste hierarchies. I think it's a fat load of baloney. It obviously will. Uh, but at the same time, the project of annihilation of caste is a long project. And we have to continue to work towards it. No, I think let me give it a
Okay,
go,
so
and then if I
coming
can't do
to
it, you can
last
rephrase
question,
it.
right? Movement. Um, what would
But
those
I
two
think
points of
is to
advice would
have
be?
a courage of your convictions, is to understand that when you often say things that people don't like to hear, that life will not be as easy, right? Uh, every day I've had to deal with death threats, rape threats, and what
Can
have
you
you.
rephrase the question? Like,
And so A is to perhaps believe that
sorry, go on.
whatever you are saying is
Okay.
is right. Second is you are not the cause, right? For those, I think it's important to remember, especially in the times that we live in, that we represent a cause. We are not the cause, either as lawyers or as activists. Uh, it is becoming increasingly people-centric, and it shouldn't be that way. Uh, it shouldn't be a race to who makes it to the front page of a newspaper or who makes it to a Times or a Forbes or a list like this. I think the idea should be to keep on doing good work, to keep on, and not to work perhaps for selfish motivations. Now, it's quite ironical that when one is on a list like this and one says that, but I think it's important to perhaps often take a step back and introspect if one is making the cause about oneself. I think one of the best advice that my boss ever gave me was that human rights lawyers should not become stories themselves. Uh, and I think that is something I try to ask myself day in and day out, is if I am becoming the story. Uh, And if I am, I think it's better to take a step back, evaluate where you're going wrong, um, and then perhaps introspect and come back.